Welcome back. We are still in the deep end on AI containment and the future it drags with it. This one is really about the fight between speed, control, and who gets to steer the wave. Because the whole argument is not whether AI arrives, but whether we can contain it. And honestly, that word contain starts sounding wild when you say it out loud. Like trying to leash a giant dog that already thinks faster than you do. And the dog is also learning your schedule. Exactly. And the scary part is the tools are not even fully mature yet. The cyber side alone already makes trust feel fragile. That voice scam example is terrifying because it hits the family layer, not just money. Right, because once audio and video can be faked cleanly, trust becomes expensive. So the answer is skepticism, but not paranoia. The interesting move is the multi-factor world getting even more layered. Which is kind of funny because AI is forcing more AI-like defense systems everywhere. Machines are now helping us defend against machines. That is already happening with fraud detection, spam, and security monitoring. But then the obvious question is, can the defender really keep pace? And that is where the whole AI versus AI idea gets weirdly real. The book's argument seems to be that humans plus AI still matter most. Which is comforting until you realize humans are also the messy part. Humans plus AI is basically the original software product pitch. That is horrible, but yes. What I keep coming back to is the incentives piece. Because status, money, legacy, and national competition all push the other way. Short-term thinking is basically baked into the system. Elections, corporate cycles, investor pressure, all of it rewards speed. So when someone says regulation will fix this, it feels a little too neat. Regulation matters, but the point is it cannot be the only lever. Because lawmakers are always learning after the thing already exists. They are basically reading the manual while the plane is airborne. And that is why he keeps talking about culture, movement, and distributed effort. Not just governments, but builders and citizens and institutions all at once. The choke points idea is fascinating because it makes containment feel physical. Cables, chips, compute, supply chains, actual points of leverage. Which is also a reminder that this is not some cloud vapor problem. The internet is still just expensive stuff in tunnels. That is the least romantic description of the internet possible. But it is useful, because it means governance can touch reality. Then there is the taxation argument, which is politically explosive. Of course, companies will flee if one country taxes them alone. That is why coordination matters more than moral speeches. And coordination is exactly what the world seems worst at right now. Especially when everybody wants the upside and nobody wants the slowdown. The other hard point is his honesty about catastrophe driving consensus. That is a brutal thing to admit, but history kind of backs it up. It is insane that we need a disaster before we cooperate properly. Yet that is often when humans actually change course. So the real gamble is whether we can act before the disaster. And that is where I keep getting stuck, because incentives feel stronger than hopes. Still, he keeps making the case that the alternative is not nothing. If containment works, the upside is ridiculous. Smarter people, cheaper energy, better medicine, better education, all of it. It is basically abundance with a very tense sales pitch. The future is amazing, please do not panic too hard. That should be on a poster somewhere. But the other side is genuinely dark, because bad actors scale too. A tiny group with powerful tools can do enormous damage now. That is the proliferation problem in one sentence. And it makes the containment idea less philosophical and more urgent. I also think the emotional part of this matters more than people admit. He sounds exhausted by it, but also weirdly energized. Like he is carrying both the beauty and the dread at the same time. Which is probably the most honest posture anyone can have right now. And the fact that he actually built a company in this space is the real tell. He is not just criticizing from a safe distance. Though I still think there is a tension there he does not fully solve. Of course there is, because the tension is the whole point. He is basically saying, I know the risks and I am still in the arena. That is either brave or slightly unhinged. Probably both, which is usually the sweet spot for founders. The last thing that stuck with me is the sacred place answer. That lake memory felt like the opposite of all this noise. Like the mind briefly remembering a world before algorithmic pressure. Maybe that is why the question lands, because containment is partly about protecting calm. Not just safety in a technical sense, but space for being human. And that feels like the right place to end this whole series. We went all the way from fear to abundance, and somehow both still make sense, which is very on brand for this whole conversation. If you listened all the way through, thanks for staying with us in the chaos. And seriously, go read, think, argue, and keep paying attention. Welcome back. We are still deep in containment, incentives, and the whole AI future mess. Today is basically the fight between what we can build and what we can control. And honestly, the most interesting part is that both sides sound right. That is the annoying genius of the whole thing. The wildest claim here is not that AI arrives, but that it has to be contained. And the pushback is obvious, because it sounds like trying to leash a giant dog. 1,000 times bigger than you, dog, just politely walking beside you. But the argument is that humanity has contained stranger things before. Gorillas, pathogens, nuclear weapons, even our own worst impulses. Which is a very humbling list if you think about it. The bigger point is that containment is a governance problem, not a fantasy problem. And governance is where the conversation gets messy fast. Because governments move like old computers when the technology moves like lightning. Old computers with election cycles. That short-term pressure is really the monster under the bed. Every leader wants growth now, votes now, momentum now. Nobody gets rewarded for being right in 20 years. That is why the incentives keep pulling away from restraint. If you are a country staring at a giant AI economy, why slow down? Especially when the prize is described like a $15 trillion bag. Nobody hears that number and becomes spiritually pure. And that is exactly the problem. The prize is enormous and the risks are diffuse. So everyone races and everyone says they are being responsible. Classic. What I keep coming back to is whether regulation can actually keep up. Because the book's answer is basically, regulation is necessary but not enough. Which is such a brutal line because everybody loves a neat policy fix. People want one committee, one act, one tidy press release. But if the people writing the rules do not understand the tech deeply, the rules lag. And the interesting move here is that the response cannot just be top-down. It needs builders, researchers, culture, and public pressure all at once. Basically, everybody has homework. Even the defensive side becomes an AI problem. Because if the attack is synthetic voices, fake video, automated fraud, you need machine defense. That is such a strange future, though. Fighting Cynthia with another Cynthia. That sounds like a terrible sci-fi franchise. But it does reflect what is already happening in spam filters, fraud detection, and security systems. The human-AI combo is still the thing that wins. In chess, in Go, in actual real-world decision-making, humans adapt too. That part matters, because it pushes back on the doom fantasy. The machine is not just arriving fully formed as a god. It still makes dumb mistakes, which is a little comforting. But comfort and safety are not the same thing. The deep fear is not one model taking over everything overnight. It is lots of small incentives pushing the world into dangerous territory. That is why the containment story keeps circling back to concentration of power. Fewer actors, fewer choke points, fewer chances for disaster. Chips, data centers, cables, access, auditing, all of it. Choke points sound almost boring until you realize they are the whole game. The fate of civilization sponsored by supply chains. And then there is this corporate structure piece, which I actually found fascinating. A public benefit corporation is a very specific signal. It says profit cannot be the only thing driving the machine, which sounds noble but also very hard to enforce in real life, especially when every other company is chasing the biggest possible upside. The market loves a race more than it loves caution. Still, I think that structural choice matters because it changes the internal moral permission. And maybe that is the quiet point. Culture inside companies matters too. Not just laws, not just speeches, but what people are actually optimized to do. He keeps coming back to the pandemic for a reason. Because it is the clearest proof that warnings do not automatically change behavior. We all saw fragility, and then somehow we still act shocked by fragility. Humanity has a short memory and a long podcast. The argument is basically that we should not wait for catastrophe to teach us again. Which is fair, but it is also painfully optimistic about our collective discipline. Collective discipline is not exactly our strongest feature. And that is why the future picture splits into two huge possibilities. One is radical abundance. Cheap energy, better food, better health care, better education, more creativity. That version is insane in the best way. It sounds like a civilization upgrade package. And the other version is proliferation of power without control. Small groups with terrible intentions suddenly getting very powerful tools. That is the nightmare side. The same networked world that spreads knowledge also spreads harm. So the whole thing comes down to whether we build the guardrails fast enough, and whether we can do that without waiting for a tragedy to force agreement. That is the part I still do not know how to trust. I mean, the logic is clean, but the politics are filthy. That should be on a mug somewhere. Maybe that is why the conversation matters so much. Not because it gives a final answer, but because it forces people to think in systems. Incentives, access, governance, speed, trust, all of it at once. And maybe that is the real theme of this whole episode. We are not deciding whether AI exists. We are deciding what kind of world gets to survive it. That feels like a strong place to leave the series. If you listened through both episodes, thank you for staying with the chaos. Go read, think, argue, and keep paying attention. Welcome back. This episode is all about containment, incentives, and the weird AI future. And honestly, the biggest fight here is not capability, it is who gets to steer it. Because if the incentives are pointing one way, regulation alone starts looking fragile. Yeah, and that is this part people keep skipping because it is inconvenient. Everyone loves the future until the spreadsheet shows up. What hit me first was that whole idea of containing something smarter than us. It sounds ridiculous until you remember we have contained plenty of dangerous things before. Yes? And also, plenty of dangerous things have absolutely escaped anyway. Exactly, so the confidence is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. But his argument is basically that civilization is a long story of building guardrails. Like pandemics, nuclear weapons, even cyber systems, all of it is containment work. The annoying part is that every new guardrail creates a new way to get around it. That is exactly why this feels less like policy and more like whack-a-mole with planet-level stakes. Whack-a-mole with trillion-dollar chips is a slightly alarming game. And that chip point matters because access is not abstract. The whole supply chain thing is so much less sexy than the doomsday talk, but more real. Cables, servers, GPUs, data centers, those are all choke points. Which means power is not evenly distributed, even if the rhetoric pretends it is. The cloud is very physical for something that sounds so mystical. Right, it is basically a giant expensive warehouse with better branding. And that is why governments can actually do something if they choose to. Not solve everything, but slow access, monitor traffic, create friction. Friction is such a boring word for what is basically survival engineering. I know nobody tweets about friction like it is a holiday. Still, his point about defensive AI was pretty convincing. If bad actors use AI, then defenses have to use AI too. Which is also slightly terrifying because you are stacking intelligences against each other. But that is already happening in spam filters, fraud detection, security systems. The difference is scale, not principle. And the trust issue is massive because deepfakes hit everyday life first. That voice scam example with the grandmother is the kind of thing that breaks your brain. It is so mundane and so sinister at the same time. The advice there was basically skepticism, verification, and more factors of authentication. Which sounds simple until you realize most people are not trained for that level of vigilance. We built a whole civilization on trusting what we see and hear. Now we need a civilization that trusts less and checks more. So the future is basically paranoia with better user interfaces. That is horrible, but also weirdly accurate. What I kept coming back to was the incentives problem. Everyone wants status, speed, scale, and legacy all at once. And if the payoff is huge, short-term restraint starts to look naive. That is why the election cycle feels absurdly small for this kind of technology. 4 years is nothing when the consequences last 30. He kept circling back to the need for a global stability function, which is basically the most ambitious governance idea in the whole conversation, but also maybe the only thing proportionate to the problem. You need international coordination because one country slowing down means nothing if the rest race ahead. Human beings do love a race when the finish line is vague and the bonus is huge. That is just human nature wearing a suit. The uncomfortable part is that he thinks real consensus usually comes after catastrophe. That is a brutal sentence because history keeps proving it. Pandemic, war, nuclear fear, Those are the moments that actually force alignment, which is why waiting for the disaster is such a bad strategy. Because by then you are not governing, you are triaging. And that is where his public benefit company idea becomes interesting. It is not heroic, it is structural, which is more useful. I like that he did not pretend a company charter fixes everything. But it does change the legal obligation from pure profit to wider responsibility, which is already a scandalous enough idea for some boardrooms. Imagine asking a traditional company to care about anything besides the chart. What did you make of his optimism at the end, though? The radical abundance thing feels inspiring and slightly dangerous at the same time. Because if AI works well, energy, food, health, and education all get dramatically cheaper. And that is not small, that is civilization-level change. Basically, the dream is that the biggest problem becomes too much abundance, which is a very elite way to have a problem, frankly. But he is right that abundance creates new questions about meaning and purpose. If work stops being the main organizer of life, what replaces it? That is the part people avoid because it sounds philosophical and inconvenient. Yet it is probably the most human part of the entire debate. He also seemed genuinely torn, which made it feel real. Not fearless, not theatrical, just carrying the burden of understanding too much. That is the cost of being early and being right about something scary. And maybe that is why this conversation mattered across 2 episodes. It was not really about whether AI is good or bad. It was about whether we can build institutions fast enough to deserve it. That is a very different question and a much better one. If you stayed with us through both episodes, seriously, thank you. Hopefully it leaves you with more questions than answers in a good way. Read, argue, pay attention, and do not let this become background noise. We will leave it there for the series, and we will catch you next time. Welcome back. This is the final stretch, and we're digging into containment, incentives, and what AI does to the future. The big question here is not whether AI arrives, but whether humans can govern it before it governs us. Because that's where the whole thing gets messy, right? The minute you say containment, somebody in the room goes, "Good luck with that." Right, because the thing you're trying to contain is already learning faster than the meeting is moving. But the argument is that we have contained powerful things before, from weapons to pathogens. And that's the optimistic case, which sounds almost rude in this conversation. Like, hey, we survive a tiger, so definitely the robots are fine. I mean, the tiger comparison is ridiculous until it suddenly isn't. The deeper point is that society has repeatedly built guardrails around things more powerful than individual people. The issue is whether AI is too slippery, too distributed, too easy to copy, and whether the people with the power to slow it down have any incentive to do that. That's the brutal part because the incentives are screaming in the other direction. Everybody wants the productivity jump, the market share, the status, the "we built it first" trophy. It's the biggest land grab since people realized the gold was in the stream. And then you layer geopolitics on top and it gets even uglier. Because no prime minister wants to be the one who slowed down a trillion-dollar boom, especially when the election cycle is basically a cardio test for panic. That was so mean, but also yes. Short-term thinking is the giant disease running underneath the whole debate. 4-year cycles are just too short for technologies that reshape civilization. By the time the consequences show up, everyone is already on to the next headline. That's why the conversation keeps coming back to institutions, not vibes. A global stability function, basically some body that can actually introduce friction. Which sounds noble until you ask who appoints the people running it. Exactly, because the minute you build the referee, everyone starts arguing about the referee. Still, the argument is that we already do this in pieces through security, trade, and regulation. The problem is that AI doesn't stay in one lane long enough for one country's rules to matter. And if one country slows down, another one races ahead. That's why containment is framed less like a ban and more like a coordinated discipline. Which brings us to cyber safety, because that's the part people actually feel now. Voice cloning is already here and it is way too convincing. A grandmother gets a fake call from a fake grandson and the whole trust layer of society shakes. That's the scary thing, because our lives are built on believing our eyes and ears. The response is not blind trust, it's layered skepticism and better authentication. One-time passwords, multiple checks, more independent signals, more verification. In other words, humanity is becoming a paranoid software update. That is terrible, but yes, basically. And the really interesting twist is that AI also has to defend against AI. Spam filters, fraud detection, camera monitoring, security systems, all of that is already machine-powered. So the future defense layer is probably going to be a lot more machine than human, which is comforting and horrifying at the same time. Very on-brand for the entire subject. Then there's the big philosophical move. Humans and AI as an iterative partnership, not a winner-take-all fight. That part matters because the story is never just the machine wins. Chess, Go, and all these other examples show people adapting alongside the tools. But the game changes when the tool can self-improve outside the box. That's exactly where the autonomy debate gets dangerous. Autonomous cars are one thing because the environment is constrained. Autonomous weapons or self-improving systems in open environments are a different beast. That's the line where the room stops being abstract. Because suddenly you're not talking about convenience, you're talking about lethal force. And then the question becomes, who gets access? How many actors get access? And how fast it spreads? That is why choke points matter so much in this framework. Physical infrastructure, undersea cables, chip supply, compute access, all of it can be throttled. It's funny how the cloud always turns out to be a bunch of very unsexy cables. Reality always ruins the branding, man. The bigger choke point is the chips because compute is the raw fuel of these systems. And that means governments already have levers, even if they don't use them well. Which circles back to the problem of coordination, because levers without alignment just create race conditions. Taxation is another lever, though that one gets everybody very loud very quickly. The second you say tax the AI companies, the capital starts packing its bags. Dubai is always waiting in the wings like a backup dancer. That's exactly the game, though, because firms and founders will move where the rules are softer. Which is why the whole thing only works if the coordination is international. Otherwise, the most responsible actor becomes the slowest actor and gets punished for it. That is such a depressing design flaw in civilization. And then there's the moral argument that really hangs over everything. Are we heading toward abundance or toward a proliferation of power in the wrong hands? If containment works, the upside is huge. Cheaper energy, better food, better health, better education. That's the radical abundance story, and honestly, it is intoxicating. Like, for once, the sci-fi pitch is not about lasers, it's about cheaper vegetables. But abundance has its own weird consequences, because comfort changes human behavior fast. We already know that from food abundance, where the downside is obesity instead of starvation. So the real question becomes not whether humans need struggle, but what kind of struggle we'll invent next. And that's actually a hopeful question, which is rare in this topic. Because if the tools are good enough, maybe meaning doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. The failure case is uglier because it's not just slower progress. It's bad actors getting access to tools that can scale harm instantly. A tiny group with powerful systems can destabilize a much larger world very fast. That's the nightmare, not some movie robot walking down a corridor. Less Terminator, more spreadsheet with bad intentions. That is horrifyingly accurate. What lands hardest in this conversation is that nobody gets to opt out. You can't just be a spectator and hope the smart people sort it out. The individual role is smaller, but it still matters. Pay attention, ask questions, use the tools carefully. Basically, stop treating it like background noise. Exactly, because the most dangerous thing is normalization before understanding. And that brings us to the end of the series, which is kind of wild. We started with the feeling that AI is moving fast, and we end with the question of whether institutions can move faster. That's the whole series in one sentence, honestly. If you've been with us for both episodes, seriously, thank you for staying in it with us. Read more, argue more, and don't let this stay abstract. We'll leave it there, and we'll catch you next time. We're finishing the AI arc with containment, incentives, and that weird future everyone keeps sprinting toward. The big fight here is simple. Can humanity actually steer this thing, or are we already late? Because the book keeps saying containment must be possible, and that is a massive claim. I mean, if AI is more autonomous than anything we've built, why would it obey our little rules? The Rottweiler metaphor is doing a lot of work there. It is, But the counter-argument is basically, we've contained dangerous things before. Gorillas, pathogens, nuclear weapons, even tigers somehow got folded into human systems. Folded in is generous, though, because we are still terrified of half of them. Fair, but the point is not perfect control, it is workable control. And the scary part is that AI is showing up in trust systems first, not just labs. Deepfake voices, fake video, scam calls pretending to be your son in an accident. That stuff is nasty because it attacks the base layer of human trust. If you can no longer trust what you hear, the whole internet starts wobbling. But the response is also AI, which is kind of the wildest part. Spam filters, fraud detection, security cameras, all of it is already machine policing machine behavior. So we built a world where the bodyguards are also robots. Exactly, and that does not sound less stressful when you say it out loud. What I found interesting is the idea of multiple factors, not just one password and vibes. One-time passwords become two-factor, then three-factor, then probably four-factor. Which is great until regular people need a manual just to move money. Yeah, security always taxes convenience. And that leads to the bigger theme. Governance is always a trade-off, never a clean win. Regulation matters, but regulation alone is too slow and too blind. Because lawmakers are trying to control a thing they barely understand in real time. That is why the argument keeps coming back to builders, culture, and institutions together. Not just banning things, but actually shaping the ecosystem around them. And then there's the incentives problem, which honestly might be the whole story. A $15 trillion prize is not exactly a chill environment for restraint. No one says, maybe let's slow down the money volcano. Especially not an election year government staring at growth charts. That is the brutal short-termism problem. Everyone gets rewarded for the near win. So who is actually responsible for thinking 20 years ahead? That answer feels weirdly underbuilt, which is the whole issue. The book's answer is basically, invent the missing global stability function before the wave hits harder. Which is huge, because that means new norms, new taxes, new choke points, new coordination. And choke points are fascinating because they're not ideological, they're physical. Undersea cables, chips, compute, supply chains, all the boring stuff that actually controls power. It is always the boring plumbing that runs the empire. Exactly. And if you tax, restrict, or monitor those levers, you can slow diffusion. But only if countries cooperate, which is where the optimism starts sweating. Because if one country breaks and another country floors it, the first one just loses. That is why the real fear is not one model, it is the race dynamic itself. And that is also why the person in the middle sounds exhausted, because they are. You could hear that tension the whole time, excitement now, dread later. But there is still a strange hope in the abundance case if containment works. Cheap energy, cheaper food, better healthcare, better education, more creativity. In that world, the problem becomes meaning, not scarcity. Which is a much nicer problem than catastrophic collapse. Very much so, yes. So the final takeaway is not doom or celebration, it is responsibility with urgency. Learn the tools, question the incentives, and stay alert instead of hypnotized. That is where we'll leave the series, and honestly, that feels like the right ending. Heavy topic, but a necessary one. Thanks for listening through both episodes with us. We'll catch you next time.